Geography 507, Geography of the Global Economy, Module 10, Part 3. We're going to continue our discussion of the transformation of the periphery, this time looking at how interdependence changes, especially in the post-World War II era, with a lot of independence, political independence by our less developed countries. Now, prior to getting to World War II, we talked about how the colonial world economy changed in the late 1800s because of a global depression, 1883 to 1896. A lot of this led to raw material overproduction in colonies as a way for the core countries to try to maintain profit. Once we get into the early 1900s, that overproduction is going to come back to haunt. And as we see profits declining, then we head into the economic depression of the 1930s in our core countries. When this happens, the core countries tend to put up different protectionist measures and work to try to protect and control their own national markets, and we see activities in our colonies substantially decline. Then we get to World War II and post-World War II, and we see certainly the United States get stimulated because of the war effort and following. Plus, following the war, we get the rebuilding of Europe and Japan and the USSR pursuing its own economic growth strategy. The bigger point here is that much of this is done without increases in productivities in the colonies. So they're kind of left hanging. At this time, many are able to obtain their independence. That may be peacefully, that may be violently, but regardless, we can see a lot of places finally getting political independence in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. Now, political independence. They still are stuck in their non-industrial raw material provider role, so they're still economically dependent. So after the war, we really see our less developed country world become born through that political independence. But that said, there's a lot of problems left because of it. I want to highlight 5 big ones that come with this decline in the colonial structure. First, we have boundaries imposed by European governments on colonial lands that are arbitrary. There's no consideration for what existed. It's simply dealing with European control for raw material or foodstuff exploitation. So we will get different cultures tied together within a political boundary that may not get along, or a culture be split. So we're going to find situations where the cultural element of nature and the political boundary of state do not line up. And we'll have competing groups, or we'll have cultural struggles that wouldn't necessarily exist if we hadn't had those boundaries imposed in the past. Now with the dominator gone, these issues rise up. And we've seen many civil wars, refugee crises, a variety of political problems, violent problems happen throughout parts of the Asias, especially happening throughout parts of Africa. Second major problem is we end up with a lot of small-sized countries and landlocked countries. If you're a very small size, the potential for agricultural and industrial development is limited. You have a small domestic market to build from. You have a small labor pool to build from. If you're landlocked, problem exists if you have things to export, but they have to go through a neighboring country that may not like you. That's going to limit economic development. And in both cases, the only serious urban development we see, and infrastructural, is coastal. getting goods out of the country onto ships and off to Europe. So we have infrastructure in terms of road and rail patterns that are geared toward taking things to one coastal center. That becomes a problem if that coastal center is no longer in your country. Part of this decline in transportation and trade networks, this lack of an extensive transportation system, helps explain the limited trade between less developed countries. The infrastructure is set to export. Not to export within the continent, but to export overseas and back to Europe. So a lot of former colonies continue to function as raw material or staples providers. Now that relates to the fourth point. Much of that provision, much of the choice of what is grown or harvested is based on demands in Europe. And we mentioned before the importance of stimulants as an export. So we tend to get a monoculture of crops, of coffee, of cocoa, of sugarcane. Well, if every country in the region is in that same monoculture, there is no need to trade between those countries. If you're growing cocoa and I'm growing cocoa, we're not trading cocoa. So we have a case where production is not geared to local demand or even regional trade. And so to earn any kind of money, you continue to export your goods to Europe. That's the economic system that's in place for you to participate in. And it leaves you with the responsibility then of having to buy the basics since you don't make them for yourselves. Perhaps the biggest problem. Arbitrary boundaries give us often issues of multiple heritages and the issue of cultures not lining up with political boundary. So governments are confronted with a lot of conflicts and contradictions within their country. What do you do to find common ground between different groups? What do you do when traditional value systems, traditional education systems, were forcibly replaced by European systems? Where do you start to find stability from which you want to then try to build economically? Now, building economically. Not all less developed countries are the same in terms of opportunities or development. Still, one thing that dangles out there like a carrot is the idea of investing in manufacturing. And part of this is what they've seen happen in more developed countries. We saw the trade of raw materials decline in the first part of the 1900s. That would suggest raw materials are not a basis for a good economy. Add to this, the U.S. pulled itself out of the Depression on its own, a large contribution to the war. We then see Europe and Japan and USSR also reinvest in manufacturing. So it looks like the smarter and more modern idea to pursue. And the richer peripheral countries start seriously looking at manufacturing as a possible strategy. So for some of the countries, we start to see the promotion of industry. Now this takes some distinct twists as we go through. Initially, in the 1960s, large, less developed countries with big domestic markets start to try to protect those markets by insisting that any multinational corporation presence involve building full factories. And we see that happen. We start to see greater corporate involvement, but not that spatial division of labor. When we get into the 70s and 80s, because of changes in transportation and communication technologies, the new strategy involving many more countries is the creation of export processing zones. This now allows corporations to break up the nature of the production process, giving us that flexible production component, and do parts of the manufacturing process in different areas. So now, a less developed country may simply become a provider of cheap labor, or a cheap raw material. Also in the 70s and 80s, we see a big rise in international loans to some countries because of oil. We also see big international loans to big less developed countries as they make an effort to industrialize and take advantage perhaps of some of the technologies gained through the 60s and 70s. With the collapse of oil prices, those countries are going to be in trouble. With the idea of becoming competitive with more developed countries, countries that are trying to industrialize find greater competition. You're not going to be invited in to have a share of the profits. So we start to see, for a whole variety of reasons, income issues, national income issues. This often leads us to looking to the International Monetary Fund for loans. They're called the bank of last resorts for reasons. Often those come with conditions that are called structural adjustment programs. Those are going to require adjustment in the national economy of the less developed country in ways that best suit more developed countries. We don't see a lot of success in the pursuit. But that said, if you don't look too deeply, we're going to see that the export of manufactured goods from less developed countries in the 60s and the 70s accounted for about 4% of world trade. But with this pursuit, by the time we get into the 1980s, it goes up to over 9%. Now, 4% to 9%, you could call a 5% increase, or you could say it more than doubled. More than doubled sounds quite attractive as an investment strategy. But this doesn't happen everywhere in the periphery. In fact, most countries have limited success in industrializing. Over 80% of our less developed country manufactured exports come out of just 10 countries. Many of these we find in the Asias. We label these now as NICs, or newly industrializing countries. They've often been referred to as the Asian tigers. And often history has played a different role in their development, as has government in the more recent time. Now that's, we'll talk about later, but different from the idea of free market approaches. Still, increase in exports. That too is misleading. When we look at durable goods, expensive stuff, machinery, technology, computers, 90% of the expensive stuff still comes from the core. 10% comes from our NICs. So the big money stuff, the big profit stuff is still going back to the more developed countries. Even the cheap stuff, non-durable goods like clothing and textiles, half is coming from the core. So yes, the NICs have their foot in the cheap stuff, not so much in the expensive stuff. And if we add to the idea of competition, of what efforts will be made to protect markets, that balance or imbalance isn't going to change. So it makes you wonder, what's the best strategy for our poorer countries? Should they be trying to industrialize? Should they be continuing their role as a raw material provider? Or should they be looking more internally and trying to do what's best for the majority of people in their country?